a Kangaroo Fern production.
Coming up next on That Podcast is Change.
Making sure that it's that it's easy to find, but also then making sure that it's consistent, and that if you're only going to post once a month, start by only posting once a month, but make sure you post every month. Make sure that that's as consistent as possible. That is one way to attract an audience and keep the audience with you. And you won't keep the audience with you if you make a podcast for 4 weeks and then you skip a week, and then you maybe have 1 week on, and then you have another 2 weeks off, and then blah, blah, blah. Nobody will do that. There's a real power in terms of habit.
Please welcome to That Podcast is James Cridland. How are you, James? Thank you for your time.
It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for asking. So,
James, let's start with, how did you come up with an idea, the podnews.net?
Yeah, so it all comes back to a meeting in a pub in Los Angeles, because of course many things do. But I've worked in radio for as you've said, more than 30 years, and one of the things that I was doing is I was going to radio conferences and talking about the future of radio, and clearly on demand is part of that. And I was talking about, is there a opportunity, for on-demand media and everything else? And we were in the pub afterwards, and a nice friend of mine was saying, "Where do you go to get news about podcasting?" And I said, "Well, I don't really know. There's one place he was talking about, but it wasn't very inclusive." And I thought to myself, that's probably something that I can do. I've written weekly newsletters for a long time, so I had a look at that, had a look at whether or not I could fit it in terms of workflow, and found out that there was probably something in it. So ended up launching a free daily newsletter all about podcasting, which I started doing in July of 2017, and I've been writing it every day since.
So that's fantastic. In 2005, you launched the first streaming radio smartphone apps. And then now you're going into a podcasting as well. So do you think radio is going to be like a future, or can be correlated with the podcasting?
Yeah, I mean, radio is still very much larger than podcasting. There are still very many more people who are watching, who are listening to the radio than listen to podcasts. So here in Brisbane, in Queensland, 94.4% of everybody in Brisbane listens to the radio at least once a week, which is quite a thing. That figure is going to be around 30% for podcasting. So, so clearly podcasting still has a long way to go, and that's very exciting because we've got so much that we can actually grow. But I think, what we are seeing is that particularly for younger audiences, on-demand content is definitely something that they're into. And the idea of sitting and waiting for the TV or waiting for the radio to give them the news or to give them a new song or whatever it might be, is just madness for them. So, on demand is clearly where the future is, and clearly where younger audiences are going. So I think radio still has a long way to go. Radio is much larger in terms of ad revenue as well. So if you look at podcasting in the US, it's about $1 billion in terms of ad revenue, whereas radio in the US is about $18 billion. So there's a big difference there. But I think podcasting fits very well in terms of the rest of audio, and I think that's very exciting.
Wow, yeah, that's exciting. So what's happening in podcasting today, and why you should care? Because I think I forgot what name of the podcast that was I think bought by the Spotify for 60 million. Aside from Joe Rogan, I think it's Dad call her daddy or something for 60
Yeah, so
million.
I
So
mean,
what's happening
plenty of
now?
yeah, I mean, plenty of shows have been bought by actually quite a lot of companies. So Spotify has jumped in and bought Call Her Daddy, which is, a successful podcast that has done very well. But then Amazon has jumped in and bought a number of different shows, including Smartless, which has 3 Hollywood stars on it. SiriusXM, which is a big satellite radio company in the US that also owns Pandora. They have bought a bunch of different companies as well, and podcasts as well. So you can see that there's an awful lot of consolidation going on, and that's fine. But that's very much the top of the tree in terms of these large podcasts which have Hollywood stars on them, and et cetera, et cetera. Actually, the real opportunity I think for podcasting is that we are here on a platform which it might have Joe Rogan on it, it might have Call Her Daddy on it, but it also has podcasts by people who are putting their podcast together in their spare room, or in their bedroom. So actually, all of the podcasts that you can get are available in this way, and that's very exciting. I think. That sort of thing, certainly when you have a look at other media, it's not easy to print a newspaper, it's not easy to launch a radio station and get the licenses and get a big transmitter and everything else. It's really simple actually to get a podcast up and running. It's not quite so easy to keep it going, and it's not quite so easy to make it profitable, but it's really easy to get one going. And I think that's the exciting thing. So yes, there is an awful lot of consolidation and an awful lot of exciting content acquisition going on in terms of the podcast space, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there's no space for the likes of you or me.
So what do you think what's happening on the podcasting industry? What's in for me and for you?
I mean, I think really, there are a few things. Firstly, there is an amount of exclusive stuff which is going on. So Amazon has just released some transcripts which are their technology and no one else's. Spotify is doing some video podcasts which you can do in other platforms, but this is a special version that only works on Spotify and only works if you're hosting with Anchor, and so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of this proprietary stuff going on, and that's really large companies trying to own this space and trying to back us all into a corner where they're in control of everything. Podcasting isn't like that, and podcasting is a very open medium which allows all of us to do a bunch of interesting and exciting things. So I don't think we're going to see too much of that really taking off. Spotify is doing an interesting job, but actually at the end of the day, the reason why podcasting is so successful is that there's loads of different podcast apps out there, there's loads of different podcasts out there, and everything is available everywhere. And so companies who jump in and want to make things exclusive are probably breaking what Spotify is all about. So that's the first thing that I would point out. But I think the second thing is, all of these people who are paying, essentially marketing podcasting, is great news for us, because that means that more people understand what podcasting is about. If your first podcast is Joe Rogan, well, great. Then your second podcast might not be. Your second podcast that you discover might be something completely different, but you only started getting into this space because you were there playing around with podcasting because Joe Rogan or Dr. Phil or whoever it might be dragged you in. So I think actually it's probably not a bad thing. There are these large companies paying an awful lot to get people comfortable with the idea of podcasting, and we all stand to benefit very well out of that, I think.
This podcast is brought to you by Kangaroo Fern Productions, Australia's independent podcast management. Book a call at www.kangaroofern.com/book now.
Thank you for that, James. So what is your advice to people who is, or any business that thinking to start a podcast in 2021?
Yeah, I mean, really, the first piece of advice I would give is do it. Go ahead. there's a lot of talk about, practice makes perfect, and you need 10,000 hours at something, and then you'll actually be good at it, et cetera, et cetera. So you will never get good at podcasts by not doing a podcast. So it's important that you actually just go ahead and do a great show. That's the first thing. I think being consistent is always a good thing. So if you set yourself up for being a weekly podcast, then every single week record something, put it out there. That might be one week a very short thing saying that you can't do a podcast this week, and that's fine. But actually producing something every single week that is there, that is consistent, is proven to work. And I think, doing a podcast about something that you are really, excited about, enthusiastic about, is the other thing. If you have no interest in real estate or no interest in cryptocurrency, don't do podcasts about those. Just because you think it might be a nice idea. Do something about what you're really interested and excited about. And so from companies' points of view, make sure that they are interesting pieces of content in their own right. Make sure that they're not just a 30-minute ad, because nobody's going to listen to a 30-minute ad. So, make your podcast as good as you possibly can. That's always a good plan.
So you're saying you have to have passion on a certain niche before you do your podcast, not just whatever the bandwagon is, you just follow them.
Yeah, I mean, don't clearly true crime is having a moment, or indeed has had a moment, perhaps. And, there are lots of very successful true crime podcasts. The secret of doing a great podcast is not to go, oh, I think since true crime is so popular, I'll do a true crime podcast. Because if you're not actually that interested in true crime, it's probably not going to be very good. So yeah, I think passion is a great word, Miko, and I think making sure that you are passionate and enthused and excited about the thing that you are podcasting about, is really important. The big difference between podcasting and, say, the radio is that the people who have found your podcast are going to be similarly interested in the things that you're interested in, because that's why they've hunted it out. That's why they've searched it out. There are over 3 million podcasts out there now, and that's why they've found your particular one. So actually, you can be as focused, you can be as niche as you want to, and make sure that you're covering the sort of information that they would be really interested in. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. Do you think the storytelling is very important as well on podcasting?
I mean, I think it depends what you're podcasting about. A great way to get a message over is to tell stories, but it isn't the only way. And I think having a listen to great shows that focus on some of the things, I mean, if you're listening to This American Life, or you're listening to 99% Invisible, some of these big shows, some of those are storytellers and they tell stories, but some of those are just different ways of presenting the same topic. And similarly, you can do all kinds of, you can present topics in different ways, but doing interviews is a good way of engaging audiences, because you've always got a different voice on every single week. It's just worthwhile knowing what you're going to ask them, know what they want to talk about, and focus on that kind of thing. But and storytelling is certainly one of those things, but it's not the only thing. Yeah.
So on international trending, so in podcasting, what are we gonna look at?
So, I mean, I think, when you start looking, it's very easy to look at podcasting, look at the United States, where podcasting is largest, and assume that podcasting is just all about the US. And assume, therefore, that it's Apple Podcasts and it's Spotify, and that's basically it. And I think that would be a mistake. Last year, there were more new podcasts in other languages made than there were in English for the first time. So podcasting is growing in all kinds of different countries now across the world. The fastest growing language is Hindi in India. And you can well understand that. There's been an awful lot of hard work in the last few years of making sure that mobile phones, for example, are very cheap, data costs are very cheap, and therefore podcasting is really growing in India like it's never grown before. And of course, there are an awful lot of people in India as well. So there are real opportunities. So if you are doing a podcast around a subject which the Indian audience might find interesting, and that's particularly things like entrepreneurship and business and that sort of thing, then making sure that you're in the Indian podcast directories is a really important thing. So there's podcast directories from companies like Ghana and GeoSavan, and there are plenty of other of these podcast directories. Making sure that you're in there for that particular audience makes a bunch of sense. But also having a look at, if you're podcasting in English, there are 125 million English speakers in India. That's great. But there are also lots of English speakers across Europe, not just in the UK and Ireland, where you would normally think. But, if you look into places like Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, everyone there speaks English perfectly. 85-90% of people there speak English incredibly well, because they're subject to an awful lot of English media. And so therefore there are real opportunities in those markets. Similarly, opportunities in other English speaking markets as well, the Philippines being another great example of a market which, if the content is right, can work really well. So I think there's real opportunities of looking at the podcasting world as if it really is a world, and if it's not, and that it's not just the US with their Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and that's kind of it. I think there's a real opportunity there.
Thank you for that. So it means if you know other language, you should just do a podcast whatever native language you have, because you said it's growing now, not only English speaking podcast.
Yeah, I mean, other languages are good. If you know other cultures, probably better than if you know other languages, because they don't always follow. But I think so yes, other languages are always helpful. The benefit of other languages is that in countries where not very many people speak English, then you've got the real benefit in that you're in their native language and you're one of only a few, a much smaller list of podcasts which are available. So when you're having a look into, for example, France or Germany, then you can see that many people in France or in Germany don't speak English very well, and doing content in those languages or in Italian or et cetera, is really helpful, because you will be quite big in that country, but also similarly not very big everywhere else. So there's always a balance there, I think, in terms of just making sure that you're doing the right thing. But English is it's the language of the internet by and large, and it seems to do very well from that point of view. So if the only language that you speak is English, which is the only language that I speak because I'm a lazy British person, then there are still great opportunities right around the world.
Thank you. Unless you have a video podcast and then you have a subtitle of different languages, so that's going to be another option. What you think?
Yeah, I mean, video podcasts are always an interesting option, and the idea of subtitles, the idea of one of the sister publications of Podnews is a newsletter called Sounds Profitable, and Sounds Profitable is all about advertising technology. And one of the pieces of advertising technology that Brian, who writes it, was testing out was a very clever piece of technology that would both translate his newsletter into Spanish, but would also you can feed the text into a piece of software that knows how Brian speaks and will record the entire thing in Spanish. It sounds like Brian reading reading his newsletter in Spanish. It's an incredible thing. So there are technological ways of doing this sort of thing as well. But I mean, really at the end of the day, people, the thing that will succeed in, I don't know, Singapore will be podcasts that are relevant and interesting for people in Singapore. And, there's an awful lot of English spoken, there's an awful lot of Malay spoken, there's an awful lot of, other languages spoken there. But the thing that will work most is relevant content for them. And so talking about mountain climbing will possibly not be so handy for somebody in Singapore because there aren't any. So so it's those sorts of things, I think, of just making sure that you that you understand what you can and what you can't do in terms of reaching new audiences, internationally.
Thank you. So next question I have is, how would you promote your podcast? There's a debate about YouTube or Facebook. Should your podcast put on this platform or not?
I mean, I come from this with my radio hat on, and when I worked in radio, I wanted to make sure that the radio station that I worked for was available in as many different places as possible. And that, to me, is an incredibly important thing. And there may only be 15, 20 people using, this particular piece of software. But if you're the only radio station on there, then brilliant. You do incredibly well. So I was working in the late early 2000s. I was working on making sure that the radio station, Virgin Radio out of the UK, was available on as many different platforms as possible, from the Nintendo Wii and the Sony PlayStation, where you wouldn't really expect a radio station to be, but we were able to get it on there, to streaming mobile apps, to satellite TV, to satellite radio, and broadcasting right across Europe and Africa, and quite a lot of Asia as well. So there's a bunch of all of this kind of stuff going on, because it's really important to get your content where your audience might be. So from that point of view, I think if you can get onto a platform without any problems, without any issues, if you can get onto YouTube, if you can get onto Facebook have just launched podcasts in the US, and they'll be rolling out internationally shortly, then get on there. There's nothing to lose by being available on all of these platforms. But I would say, though, you just need to make sure that you work your workflow correctly, and make sure that you're not spending an awful lot of time chasing a small amount of audience. So make sure that so the Podnews itself has a podcast. It is uploaded every single day onto YouTube. That is completely automatic, and I wrote a piece of code which uploads the thing automatically. It encodes it into video. It does some fancy wavy lines these days, and and all that kind of stuff to make it look fun. And it uploads it automatically onto YouTube, and it does that without me spending any time on it whatsoever. And that's important, because typically that will get 15 plays. It's not an awful lot. I get about 2,700 plays a day, and 15 plays is not a lot. But it's 15 plays that, from my point of view, are brand new plays that have never found me before. And if one of those plays goes on to somebody subscribing to the podcast or getting the newsletter, even better, then that's a great thing. So I think be on as many places as you possibly can, as long as they're not extra work for you. But things like Facebook in particular are completely automatic. You can automate getting into YouTube with various things, including Headliner. So I would certainly have a look into that, and be available in as many different places as possible.
All right. Thank you so much for that. So if you have, say, a billboard to write, one short piece of advice to all our listener and our audience, what would you say, particularly people who is on early stage on podcasting?
I mean, I think the first thing that I would say is make your podcast, give your podcast a really obvious name. There are lots of people who think of a very clever name for their podcast, either a very clever name or a name which has been used before. Go to Apple Podcasts and search for Real Talk, for example, and you will discover that there are, I think, more than 300 podcasts called Real Talk. Don't call yourself that. Call yourself something which is really obvious what your podcast is about. Most podcast apps only search the title of the podcast and the title of every episode, and that's it. So really focus on, if your podcast is about, Parcast used to be really, really good at doing this. Parcast made a load of podcasts that were very cleverly titled. They made a podcast about serial killers, and it was called Serial Killers. And they made a podcast about a daily astrology, reading for you to find out what was going on in the stars for you, if you believe in any of that stuff. And they called it Daily Astrology Reading. Really obvious. Make it really clear, rather than trying to go, what's in the stars, or all of that kind of stuff. So that I think that's probably the number one mistake that I see podcasters make. And then, making sure that it's, that it's easy to find, but also then making sure that it's consistent, and that if you're only going to post once a month, start by only posting once a month, but make sure you post every month. Make sure that that's as consistent as possible. That is one way to attract an audience and keep the audience with you. And you won't keep the audience with you if you make a podcast for 4 weeks and then you skip a week, and then you maybe have 1 week on, and then you have another 2 weeks off, and then blah, blah, blah. Nobody will do that. There's a real power in terms of habit. And I don't know about you, but I still wake up to the radio every single morning. It's a habit that I've had in my life. And one of the things that drives that is just the habitual thing of waking up to the radio every single morning, which is a good thing. And I think habit is a very important thing for podcasting as well. So if you come out on a Friday, be there on a Friday every single week.
All right, thank you so much for that, James. So to our listener and audience, where can they contact you?
So you can get the Podnews newsletter for free at podnews.net, which also has my contact details there as well. Or you can find it on your podcast app, or indeed your smart speaker, by asking to play the latest news from Podnews Podcasting News. So there's lots of different ways. But the newsletter is probably best, which is just at podnews.net, and it's free.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you for your time. Thank you. Thank you for another episode of the That Podcast Exchange with James Cridland, the editor of Podnews.net. See you next week. Bye.
This podcast is brought to you by Guerrilla Podcast Syndicate, powered by Kangaroo Fern Media Lab. Kangaroo Fern is Australia's independent video and podcast management agency with the mission to help individuals and entrepreneurs to start their own podcasts and harness the power of podcasting. Book now via www.kangaroofern.com. Are you ready to finally start your own podcast? Maybe you already have one, but need a podcast manager to help you level up. We're here for either. Book a call at www.kangaroofern.com. www.kangaroofern.com.